Mm-hmm.
The Maniac, the Model, and the Murder That Shook the Nation. Now, this is a recent book, just 2014. What's this one about?
Well, that was about a very notorious triple murder. One of the things I'm interested in as a writer is the fact that kind of periodically, there'll be these crimes that are huge nationwide sensations at the time, but that fade from public memory. And then there are other crimes that obviously just enter into cultural mythology and become sort of an undying part of it, like the Lizzie Borden case.
Right.
The Mad Sculptor is about a crime that was a nationwide sensation back in 1937. This young man named Robert Irwin, who was a very talented sculptor, murdered 3 people in New York City on Manhattan's East Side on Easter Sunday, 1937. These members of a family that he was very close to and had actually boarded with for a while. He killed one of the victims, is a very, very beautiful young woman named Ronnie Gedden, who had been a model for various true crime pulp magazines, True Detective, and so on and so forth. So there were all these photographs of her that had been taken in which she was either partially dressed, in some cases totally nude. So, it had all these, and of course, this is the heyday of tabloid journalism. So there are all these elements that made this crime very, very sensational. There was this beautiful, supposedly sexually promiscuous young woman who was the victim. There were the circumstances of the discovery of the crime. She was found naked on a bed. Her mother, whom Irwin also killed, strangled her with bare hands, was shoved under the bed that her daughter's naked body was found on top of. Then there was a third victim who was a boarder who had been stabbed to death with an ice pick. Anyway, very, very sensational triple murder. It also happened in a very, very fashionable neighborhood, a place called Beekman Place on the east side of New York. And there was Irwin himself. He was he was obviously quite crazy, but he was also sort of a brilliant young man who was a very talented sculptor and was the son of some well-known religious zealots, really. So it just had all these tabloid-ready ingredients that made it a huge, huge case back in 1937. Irwin managed to elude this massive manhunt in New York and make his way ultimately to Chicago, where he turned himself in. The case became, he was defended by a very famous lawyer named Samuel Leibowitz, who at that time was also defending the Scottsboro Boys, which was one of the most famous civil rights cases of the 20th century. So, so that was the case of the Mad Sculptor. When I'm looking around for something to write about, I try to find stories that have interesting characters, and again, have interesting stories. It's not just about the gruesomeness of the crime. There are many all too many horrible and gruesome crimes that take place all the time, but they don't make for particularly interesting stories. So.
Now, do you think he sought out the model? Do you think he sought her out because he saw her on these true crime magazines?
No. He had actually boarded with the family, and he was friends with the model. He was friends with the whole family, and he was actually obsessed with Ronnie. That was the name of the model. He was actually obsessed with Ronnie's sister. He had hoping the sister would marry him. I mean, it's a kind of a complicated story, but to give the short version, Irwin, again, who was psychotic, really. I mean, he could seem very, very lucid for periods of time, but fundamentally, he was quite mad. he had actually, several years earlier, while boarding with the Gedeon family, he had attempted to slice off his own penis.
Oh, my God.
Because he believed that by somehow killing off his sexual energy, it would sort of channel all that sexual energy would be channeled into his art. So he tried very, very seriously, actually, to slice off his penis. And he ended up in Bellevue Hospital being treated by a very, very famous New York psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham. But before slicing off his penis, he had become obsessed with this other Gedeon sister. And she was the one. Anyway, he ultimately decided several years later, when she refused to marry him, that he was going to kill her. And he showed up at the Gideon house intending to kill the sister, but the sister wasn't there. So he ended up killing the mother, and then ended up killing Veronica, and then ended up killing the boarder. So.
Okay, so this guy was going to slice his penis off because he was a sculptor.
Yes.
Have you seen this art? Was it worth anything?
Said, actually, I actually own a piece of his art.
Oh my God! Really? Oh, this must be some pretty good art then. What is the art good?
Yeah, it's pretty good. Well, I mean, what happened was that after my book came out, I was contacted by a woman, a very lovely elderly woman who lives down in Alabama, who told me that, she had seen my book or read about my book, and that her ex-husband's father, her father-in-law, had actually worked in a mental institution where Bob Irwin was an inmate. And Irwin, who had been institutionalized for quite a number of years, would make these different art objects and sell them to the doctors and the nurses and the orderlies. And this woman's father-in-law had purchased this very beautiful hand-carved wooden box that had been mas by Bob Irwin. What was really kind of amazing about it is on the cover of the box, there's a bas-relief sculptor of Ronnie Gedeon posing nude, because she used to pose nude for Bob when he was a boarder. And anyway, I ended up purchasing this item from this woman. So.
Okay, very interesting. And that's going to bring me to another question I was going to ask you. Is that because a lot of these stories you seem to research are old, they're historic. Now, you can't really interview people that were first-hand witnesses and stuff like that. So what do you do? You find the court transcripts? What do you do?
Yeah, you find a lot of material, old newspapers, transcripts, psychiatric reports, so on. But, I am sometimes able, obviously, not to. Well, with the Gein book, I went to Plainfield, and I did interview people who knew Gein. I'm often, with another book I wrote called The Devil's Gentleman, I was able to track down family members, descendants of the murderer's family, many of whom, have kind of interesting family stories to tell. Some of them have, documents. They have letters or journals and things like that. I try to accumulate as much material as I possibly can. Sometimes I'm working on a book now about a murder that happened in Indiana back in 1908. A bunch of murders. And, I went to the town, and they have a historical society with all kinds of information. Often hire a researcher to help me in various ways. I end up accumulating literally thousands of pages of documents before I start writing the book. So,
gotcha. Now this book here, Psycho USA, famous American killers you never heard of. Give us some good ones.
Well, again, I'm very interested in why certain certain crimes, become immortalized in our culture, and other equally heinous crimes, which at the time of their commission, might have, become nationwide sensations, are so quickly forgotten. So, and some of these cases are ones I always thought, wow, I'd maybe really at some point like to write a book about this, but I realized that I was never going to live long enough to write a book about each one of them. So I decided to just write sort of short accounts of each one of these. Some of them were these female poisoners that I mentioned before. There was one called Lydia Sherman, one called Sarah Jane Robinson. These were two women back in the 1870s who murdered about a dozen family members, husbands and children and siblings sometimes. One case I was very interested in, there was a very notorious axe murder that happened in the late 1800s. It was actually the most sensational American axe murder before the Lizzie Borden case. It happened. There's a little cluster of islands that are between off the Maine, New Hampshire coast. One of the islands is called Smutty Nose, and the Isles, this little archipelago, really, it's called the Isles of Shoals. And there was a family of Norwegian, these Norwegian fishermen and their wives and sister-in-laws living on this island, and they were and when the men were away on this fishing trip, one of their former employees named Louis Wagner rowed out to this little rowed, R-O-W-E-D, out to this little isle, and and murdered two of the women. The third woman escaped, and it was called the Smutty Nose Horror. A very, 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 very sensational case at the time. It was also written, coincidentally, there was a famous American poet named Celia Thaxter, whose family owned a hotel on the adjacent little island. And she ended up writing a very famous early true crime story about the case. So, and then there are some forgotten serial murders. There was a guy named Joseph LePage, who was called the French Monster, who committed these horrible sexual mutilation murders on a couple of women, also in New England. So the book has, I can't remember exactly how many, but there are probably 30 or so cases that I recreate in this book of long forgotten, notorious, mostly serial killers.
Harold, we're getting toward the end of the show. What do you want to leave us with, and how can people find you and stuff like that?
Well, let's see. What do I want to leave you with? Well, I guess one thing that, fascinates me is, a lot of people think, especially nowadays with all this fascination with, the podcasts and, my dog's talking, programs like Netflix making it for sure, right. The cable TV shows, true crime is a very, very recent thing. One thing that is important to keep in mind is that people have always had an appetite for true crime stories. The oldest true crime book that I'm aware of was published around Shakespeare's time. There's, again, something about reading about these cases that is important to our imaginations and even, in a way, to our psychological stability, because, I think both as individuals and as a society, civilized, moral people need some socially acceptable outlet for their darker impulses, and that reading true crime, provides a suitable outlet for that.
Okay. And how can people get a hold of you? If they want to confess or something. Let's say I want to confess